Well, good evening, folks. Welcome to 3 Zen. This evening, I'm going to share the second story in the book of Sam that I have, and it's about a crash that he was involved in at Korat Air Force Base in Thailand in 1964. So, as I mentioned earlier on this series of videos, I just like reading these stories in Sam's words without ad libs or paid political announcements or any of that crap. So here we go. The date was 27 September 1964, and the bird, the F-105, was 62-4318. Plain and simple. This was a pilot error crash. I took a perfectly good F-105 and bashed it into the trees. But it was a tough bird that the maintenance magicians fixed. It survived the war, and this great machine now sits on a pedestal in Centralia, Illinois. These were strange times for many of us in the three F-105 squadrons. We had 24 fully mission capable, we called that FMC, birds on alert in Korea, and I think 24 FMC birds in Thailand. These deployments left very few flyable birds at the home station, Yokota Air Force Base, Japan. In the weeks before the crash, I was at the home station and was getting very little flying time. My Form 5, our flying record, showed 3 landings in a month before the crash. On the 25th of September 1964, it was time to head south to Korat Air Force Base, Thailand. I boarded a C-130 for a hop to Kadena Air Base, Okinawa, and then a hop to Korat. The C-130 landed at Kadena broken, so we had to stay overnight and did not get out until the afternoon of 26 September. We landed at Korat late in the afternoon, where I was assigned a cot in the tent next to the officers' club tent. I was also told to be on the flight line the next morning for the first flight. I didn't sleep much that night and awoke at, I think, about 0400. It was still dark. Rich Graham was the flight leader for the 4-ship flight. Lee White was number 2, Charlie Hansen was number 3, and I was number 4. Rich briefed that it would be a local flight and that we were going to practice a new maneuver that was being developed at Nellis Air Force Base, Nevada. It was called a Popup maneuver and involved a low-level, high-speed run to a point offset from the target where you pulled up into a steep climb and then rolled over the top into a dive run. As I later discovered, the offset needed to be a fairly long distance from the target due to the turn radius of the F-105. So we'll pause here a minute. They would come in like this and then pull up into a steep dive, and then at the top of the dive just roll over, try to acquire the target, and then settle into a dive. When we took off, it was daylight. We flew around for a bit until the wing tanks were dry. Rich called out a target and had us set up for the attack. I don't remember how many runs we made before the crash, as I remember at least one good pass, but I do remember the last pass. I pulled up hard and was tight in the turn over the top inverted. As I rolled out for the dive, I knew I was steep and slow. I kept the power on and pulled to the buffet, but the G's were low and the bird was sinking. It hit hard, nose up, but it hit with a flying wing and was not stalled. The bird blew through the trees and came out with enormous vibration and a hard left rolling moment. It took full right stick and full right rudder to control the roll. I thought I would have to eject, so I was reaching for altitude. I could see the tanks were rolled up and over the wings, so I punched them off, and that helped the vibration a bit. I didn't notice at the time that the leading edge flaps were gone. I still had a hard left rolling moment, but that got easier as I got some altitude and started slowing it down. I seem to remember climbing to 10,000 feet, but I'm not sure about that. All the systems in the bird seemed to be functioning, so I slowed below 250 knots and dropped the gear, which came down and locked normally. I called Korat Approach Control and told them I had a damaged bird and needed a long straight-in approach. They responded they had an 800-foot overcast with good visibility underneath. I came through the overcast at over 200 knots as I felt I needed the speed for control and was lined up with the arming area. There were 2 birds in the arming area, and one of them was powering up and blowing dirt to get out of the way. I moved to the right and spiked it on the runway at about 200 knots, well above the drag chute limit. I lowered the nose and went full on the brakes. It didn't seem as if I was getting anything from the brakes, as the anti-skid had to be cycling, and I had to wait to 170 knots for the chute. The chute came out and held, and the bird started slowing. I got it stopped and taxied in. It's a good thing I didn't need the tail hook, as I left it at the crash site. The walk around of the bird showed the leading edge flaps were gone. The Bombay doors had been pushed up and burst the Bombay fuel tank. Most of the ribs from the Bombay were broken. The ventral fin and the tail hook were gone. The left stabilizer had been sheared from the crossover tube and was cranked into the side of the fuselage, which accounted for the full left rolling moment. The left stabilizer was jammed in an up position, so the right stabilizer was doing all the pitch control. The bird was lifted to the Iran inspection and repair as necessary facility in Tainan, Taiwan, in pieces where it was repaired. As you can see by the picture, it looks like a new airplane now. The squadron commander was Bill Peters, who was a stern, no-nonsense guy, and he called Rich and me into the office. Needless to say, I was shaken a bit about things and was worried as I went into the office. But Colonel Peters calmly asked us to tell him what happened. Rich told him of the briefing and all he knew about the mission. I told him I had just screwed up the maneuver and could not make the pullout. Colonel Peters called us all together later that day and told us essentially there were 2 kinds of pilot error accidents. One is a pilot screwing around with a private air show and he crashes. The other is a pilot trying to do the job assigned and he crashes. He added that my crash was the latter, that it was a line of duty crash, that I was trying to manage the assigned mission and it did not work out. He said, "We will support Sam through this problem." I admired Bill Peters before that day and much more after that day. A few days later, I returned to Yokota Air Base on a C-130 landing close to midnight. My wing commander was Chester Van Etten, and he met me at the aircraft, which was a surprise for me. He didn't say much more than, "Sam, I think the old man's going to kick your ass and my ass off the base." I remember this direct quote very well. I asked what he meant, and he said the commander of the 41st Air Division, Colonel Maurice Martin, wanted me in his office at 0700 the next morning. Needless to say, I did not sleep that much that night, so it was easy to be up early. I suited up in a Class A uniform and drove to the Air Division headquarters. I left early as I had never been to the headquarters and was not sure how to get there or where the headquarters building was located. I got there early and the secretary was kind of laughing when she said Colonel Martin was waiting for me. Needless to say, I was in a great state of concern at that moment. I went into the office, saluted, and said I was reporting as ordered. Colonel Martin was smiling. He saluted back, and then he said, "You almost busted your ass." I told him it was close, and then he said, "What would I have told your mother?" I asked why he would be talking to my mother, and he said they'd gone to high school together in Bluefield, West Virginia. He told me not to worry about the crash, and then we spent an hour talking about Bluefield and Beaver High School. I went back to Yokota where Colonel Van Etten wanted to know what happened. I told him Colonel Martin told me to keep up the good work. I did not tell him about my mother, Bluefield, or Beaver High School connection until many years later. All the senior officers then were special people. I visited Colonel Van Etten several times a year when he was in his 90s. I was with him just a month or so before he died at 95 years. My eyes get cloudy a bit when I think of Bill Peters and Colonel and Chester Van Etten. The effects of the crash stayed with me for more than a year. The movie Top Gun showed that when crews crash the Tomcat, it isn't fear but a loss of confidence that is necessary for controlling a bird like the F-105. Those of you who play golf know of the problems when you start to think too much about what you're doing. Movements have to be natural and without thinking about the move. Fortunately, I got back to being comfortable and natural in the thud. And he went on to have a great career. So I had met, through my father-in-law, I had met this Colonel Bill Peters, and he was quite a guy. And I also although I'd only met him a couple times, I held him in high esteem. At any rate, that was Sam going through the trees, and I am so glad he made it. Thanks for stopping in, and we'll talk to you again soon.